Good morning. Well, thank you everyone for coming and welcome to today's proceedings. This year marks the 16th annual Day of Common Learning at Seattle Pacific, a day that we set aside each year to engage in deep thought and conversation around a topic of interest and concern. Our theme this year is Always Reforming. This October marks the 500th anniversary of the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, the date when professor, priest, and monk Martin Luther published his 95 Theses. The Theses are a list of propositions that advanced Luther's propositions against what he saw as abusive practice by the church, selling plenary indulgences, certificates believed to reduce the punishment of sins. The Protestant position would come to incorporate doctrinal changes such as complete reliance on Scripture as a source of religious authority, and the belief that faith in Jesus and not good works is the only way to obtain God's pardon for sin. The indulgence controversy set off by these theses was just the beginning of the Reformation, a schism in the Catholic Church which initiated profound and lasting social and political change in Europe. The initial movement within Germany diversified, and other reform impulses arose independently of Luther. For example, the spread of Gutenberg's printing press provided the means for rapid dissemination of religious materials in everyday vernacular. Our theme, Always Reforming, is in honor of this significant event in the history of the church, and in acknowledgement that the life of the church and within Christian communities should never be static or stagnant, but rather always reforming for the sake of faithful witness to our world. We are delighted that Dr. Soong-Chan Rah from North Park University is with us this morning as our keynote speaker. This afternoon, we invite you to participate in one or more of the 23 breakout sessions described in your program. And afterwards, we invite you to join us again for a film screening on homelessness in tent cities. I trust that you'll be intellectually and spiritually enriched by today's offerings. Thank you for joining us as we consider the importance of always reforming. Here to introduce Dr. Rah is our provost, Jeff Van Duzer.
Good morning. It is really my privilege to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Soong-Chan Rah and to welcome him to our campus. Dr. Rah is currently a professor of church growth and evangelism at North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, where he's taught for over a decade now. But I want to take you back actually to a little more than 2 decades ago, to 1996, a year that I suspect was before some of you were born, when Soong-Chan and a group of 6 or 7 other ethnically diverse young people began to meet together in a prayer group and to pray and dream about planting a church in the Central Square neighborhood of Cambridge, Massachusetts. Central Square is a very diverse, a very urban neighborhood in Cambridge. It's often been an overlooked neighborhood living in the shadow of Harvard Square. And during the 2 prior decades, the area had suffered from increasing crime and general decay. But this was the neighborhood that Dr. Rah was drawn to. And his prayer group met over the spring and the summer, and then in the fall, 1996, Cambridge Community Fellowship Church was launched, and Dr. Rah served as the founding senior pastor for about a decade of what became and continues to be today a multi-ethnic church living out the values of racial reconciliation and social justice in an urban context. And it's this intertwining of a heart for social justice, a call to ministry, all done in the context of an urban setting, that seems to be the thread that winds through Dr. Rah's career. As he notes on his own webpage, urban ministry is for him a passion, and he's characterized the urban environment as complex, constantly changing and always challenging. His heart for social justice finds expression in his service on the board of World Vision and Evangelicals for Justice. He's previously served on the board of Sojourners at Christian Community Development Association. He is the author or co-author of a number of important books, including Return to Justice, Forgive Us, Confessions of a Compromised Faith, Prophetic Lament, A Call for Justice in Troubled Times, and the book that actually grounds his talk for this morning, The Next Evangelicalism, Freeing the Church from Western Cultural Captivity. Dr. Rah received his bachelor's degree from Columbia University, his MDiv from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, his THM from Harvard University, his DMin from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and his THD from Duke University. It's hard to imagine there are any more things out there for him to go get. On a personal note, Dr. Rah is married, has 2 children. He is a Baltimore Orioles fan. And a little known fact that apparently we were able to pry out of one of his colleagues, before his family moved to the United States, he was a child model in Korea. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Soong-Chan Rah.
Thank you, SVU. Thank you so much for this very kind invitation. I'm going to have to figure out who ratted me out with that information about my child modeling years. I was actually in Korea this summer. We went on a family trip for the first time for my kids to go to Korea. And we were in this little souvenir shop in Seoul. And I saw a pack of postcards that said Customs and Traditions of Korea. And for whatever reason, I noticed the cover photo of this pack, and I said, that looks really familiar. So I opened it up, and I started leafing through about the 20 postcards that are there. And 3 of the postcards featured me. So if you go to Korea, look for those photos. My photos are still out there. 45 years later, what I modeled for are still out there in Korea. I'm so thankful for this theme and this opportunity to address you on these very critical matters. The theme of always reforming. The idea that change is kind of constant in the world that we live in. The gospel doesn't change. The truth of the gospel is the same the yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But the context into which the gospel is spoken and communicated oftentimes will change, and very dramatically it will change. And so oftentimes when we think about things like reformation, we have to understand that it's not the gospel that changes, it is the context that has changed, and the gospel now speaks into that new context. So the idea of theological reformation is also, in some part, cultural adaptation. And that the cultural changes that occurred 500 plus years ago was what led to many of the theological reforms. The advent of the printing press and the innovation around communication, changes in governance and in the nation state, an emerging worldview that was radically different from the previous generation's worldview. These were all factors that were cultural changes that would lead to the theological reform that was necessary for that time. I would argue that maybe we are in that time period again, when there are social changes and demographic changes and cultural changes that might require reform. But before we look ahead, let's look back. Let's look back and say, what is one of the earliest reforms? What is the earliest place where we encounter Reformation? And it might not be 500 years ago, it might be actually 2,000 years ago. When in the early church, in Acts chapter 15, we encounter this movement towards reform. Acts chapter 15, as many of you know, tells us the story of the Jerusalem Council. The Jerusalem Council was convened because there were some drastic and dramatic cultural changes that were occurring in the church at that time. The church, when it first started, as many of you know, started in the context of Judaism. It was essentially a sect or a subset of Judaism and found its profound expression in the early stages within the context of Judaism. But some demographic changes were occurring within that time period. The most significant, of course, would have been the transition from a Jewish, Judaic kind of centered Christianity to much more of an inclusion of Gentile Christianity. What had started off as a subset of Judaism, by the time we get to about Acts chapter 15 and we encounter the stories of the book of Acts, we're beginning to see that demographic transition from a Jewish-centered Christianity to now more and more Gentiles, Christians in the church. This, of course, is found in the backdrop of some historical animosity between Jews and Gentiles. A pious Jewish male would pray, I thank you that I am not a dog, I thank you that I'm not a female, and most of all, I thank you that I'm not a Gentile. The history of animosity and tension between Jews and Gentiles, and in this backdrop you are seeing the drastic demographic changes, the transition from a Jewish population of Christians to a much more Gentile population of Christians, and that's what we encounter in Acts chapter 15 at the Jerusalem Council. A reform was needed because there were social changes that were occurring, especially demographic changes in the culture at that time. Now, let's flash forward 2,000 years and talk about some of the changes that are occurring over the last 20, 30, maybe even 50 years of the church's history. Dale Robert, Boston University professor, missiology and historian, notes that if you were to ask the question, what is the typical Christian in the year 1950? And you pull together all the Christians of the world and say, let's find one person that represents Christianity in the world in the year 1950. And if you were to describe that person as a white male in his 50s, living in an affluent American upper-middle-class suburb, that would be a fairly accurate picture of the face of Christianity in the year 1950. So these faces, except for the guy in the right-hand corner, that's Larry the Cable Guy, except for the guy in the right-hand corner, these are the faces that would say, this is what Christianity looks like in the year 1950. If you ask that same question now in the year 2017, the answers, of course, would be drastically and dramatically different. That answer would be more likely a peasant woman outside of Lagos, Nigeria. More likely to be a teenager in Mexico City. More likely to be a university student in Seoul, South Korea. The face of Christianity, as Dana Robert notes, has shifted from a Western face to a much more Southern Hemisphere and Eastern Hemisphere. Philip Jenkins has popularized this notion by looking at the different ways that Christianity has changed. For about 5 centuries, he notes, that Christianity was linked to the story and narrative of North America and Europe. The overwhelming majority of Christians resided in North America and Europe. Barrett and Johnson, who do an atlas for world Christianity, notes that if you, in the year 1900, were to put a thumbtack in the map to say where is the population center of Christianity, you would put it right in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean, because so much of the world's Christian population would have been in Europe and North America. But Jenkins notes that that has changed over the last 100 years or so. Over the past century, the center, meaning the 20th century, the center of gravity has shifted away from Europe and North America to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We will see a new boom of Christianity in the 21st century, but the vast majority of believers will be neither white, nor European, nor Euro-American. So what Jenkins notes, and what Barrett and Johnson also note, is that that thumbtack you would have put in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean would now be outside of Timbuktu, Africa, because the population center of Christianity has shifted so dramatically away from Europe and North America to Latin America, Africa, and Asia. You can see in these numbers that in the year 1900, the overwhelming majority of Christians in the world resided in, quote-unquote, the white continents of Europe and North America. 80 to 85% of Christians would have been found in Europe and North America. A very small percentage would have been found in places like Africa and Asia and Latin America. By 100 years later, from 1900 to about 2005, you can see already the dramatic change in the population of global Christianity. So that now 19% of Africa makes up global Christianity. 17% of Asia Christianity makes up global Christianity. You see the greatest drop, of course, in European Christianity, which goes from 68% of the world population down to 26%. So that now we can say by the year 2005, about 60% of the global Christian population resides in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, the quote-unquote non-white continents of the world. The projection is that by the year 2050, we will see even more of a dramatic change, in that African Christianity makes up almost 30% of global Christianity. Asian Christianity is 20%, and European and North American Christianity is now below 30% of the global Christian population. I have there in quotation marks, white and non-white. Because if you look at the patterns within European Christianity, you will note that European Christianity is also a significant percentage of non-white European Christians, such as the fastest growing church in London, which is a Nigerian church. the fastest growing church in Stockholm, Sweden, which is also a Pan-African church. So everywhere you look within Europe, the churches that are growing tend to be Pan-African or immigrant churches. So if we project those numbers into the 2050 projection, we would find that probably 80 to 85% of the world Christian population will be of non-European descent. What I want you to note is the transition from this number to, if this number is adjusted, that 80 to 85% of the Christians in the world are non-white, whereas here 80 to 85% of the Christians in the world were white. In 150 years, we completely flipped these numbers from 85% white to 85% non-white. This number was what existed for about 1,500 years of church history. So in a tenth of the time, 1,500 years of church history has been flipped on its head, completely flipping over the numbers of the makeup of global Christianity. This is a revolutionary moment that we are living right in the middle of. This is a dramatic, demographic, global Christian transformation that is occurring right before our eyes. Now, I'm going to assume that for many of you, this is not new news. This is a historical reality now. This is not a speculation of what may come. This is the acceptance of the reality of the situation. Many, many authors, historians, missiologies have well documented this drastic change. Andrew Walls, Lamin Sanneh, Dana Robert, Barrett and Johnson, Philip Jenkins, they've all well documented that we are living in an era where Christianity is flipping over in its demographics. One of the questions I'm asking, though, is that not only are we seeing this huge demographic change in global Christianity, are there also similar changes that are occurring in U.S. Christianity, particularly U.S. evangelicalism? In 1965, the Immigration Reform Act changed what America began to look like. Philip Jenkins notes that because of this change in 1965, we will begin to see very drastic changes in American society, in the ethnic makeup of American society. These are some important dates to look at. In 1965, there was a change in the immigration laws. Now, one thing to note about this change is that this change did not mean that America all of a sudden said, let's let anybody and everybody in. It wasn't that in 1964, 200,000 immigrants came in, and in 1966, 6 million immigrants came in. There's actually never been a moment where American society has said, let's just fling the doors open and let anybody and everybody in. Correction, one time when Columbus showed up and the Native Americans said, yeah, let's let some folks in, and that was kind of the unfettered immigration. That's the only time in American history where that has happened. The rest of the time, there's always been very strict limitations, particularly on the number of immigrants. So, for example, if you are in the Philippines now and you want to legally immigrate to the United States, you are put on a waiting list that's about 25 to 35 years long. There's always been strict restrictions on the number of immigrants. In fact, when we look at the transition here, it's not the number of immigrants that increased completely uncontrolled. It was actually the shape and distribution of immigrants that changed in 1965. So prior to 1965, you had most immigrants coming from Europe and North America. Post-1965, gradually more and more immigrants are coming from Asia and Latin America. So that from 1965 forward, you get a very slow but gradual increase of diversity because there are there's a different distribution of immigration. You'll note the time as well, 1965. This is at the height of the civil rights movement. And so what 1965 did was not, let's let anybody and everybody into our country. What it did was it did away with racist laws. Prior to 1965, there were a number of laws that said we would not take certain immigrants from certain parts of the world. The first of these laws was called the Chinese Exclusion Act. Can anybody guess what that might have done? Yeah, they really weren't hiding anything here. They were pretty clear. We want to exclude Chinese people. What should we do? Let's pass the Chinese Exclusion Act to exclude Chinese people. There was a series of laws like this, explicitly saying we don't want certain people from certain parts of the world. And we will pass laws to ban them from coming into our country. I'm so glad we're so past that as a nation. So what you see in 1965 is not the flinging open of the doors of immigration, let's let anybody and everybody in. There's a rush of 1 million people trying to cross the Rio Grande. That's fake news. That didn't happen. What we see instead is the gradual increase of immigration. In fact, when we look at Mexican immigration, this is the Pew Research Foundation, not the most liberal think tank in the world, saying that between 2009 to 2014, net immigration from Mexico was minus 140,000. We're losing immigrants to Mexico, not gaining immigrants from Mexico, unlike what the political pundits might be telling us. In fact, if you remember 25 years ago, no, most of you weren't born, but if you remember 25 years ago, there was a time when we started talking about this illegal immigration problem, the undocumented immigrant problem. And the numbers that got thrown out there was, there are 10 to 12 million undocumented immigrants in our country. We've got to deal with that. 20 to 25 years later, and we're still talking about the problem, what's the number we're still dealing with? 10 to 12 million. So we're not talking about we went from 10 million undocumented to 40 million undocumented. We're still roughly at about the same number because the net immigration is roughly zero. So what we're dealing with is not this unfettered immigration that has occurred over the last few years, but a slow, gradual immigration. In fact, what we're seeing in the diversity of America is not tied to immigration patterns, it is tied to birth rates. It's tied to birth rates. So with this slow influx of non-white immigrants, by 2008, a third of the US population was non-European descent. By 2011, we had already passed a significant threshold. Half of all the births in the United States were now of non-European descent. This is a huge moment in American history. The demographics are changing, not on the adults, but among the children in birth rates. Now, the next number should be pretty obvious. 5 years after the birth rate changes, 5 years later, the incoming kindergarten class numbers change. So that 5 years after the birth rate changes is when the first incoming class is of non-European descent. The majority is of non-European descent. It starts moving a little bit faster, so that the projection is by 2023, half of all the children in the United States will be of non-European descent. That's only 6 years away, 6, 7 years away. That's when we'll see this drastic change where half the children in America will be of non-European descent. This number is important to me because I work at a Christian college. And those of you who are here at a Christian college and other Christian colleges better take heed of this number. Because I've been to too many Christian colleges. 10 years ago, they were at 2,000. They were 95% white. Now they're still 95% white. They're at about 500. Because they're not paying attention to these numbers. Because if you really want to see these Christian colleges flourish, you are going to have to really take into account that the incoming class of 2023 forward is going to be extraordinarily diverse. And if your student body is not ready for that, and if your student body and your administration and your faculty is not ready for that, then you're going to die as an institution pretty quickly. So 2023 is an important number because that, again, shows the change not because of immigration, but because of birth rates. And of course, the inevitability of 2042, which is that half of the U.S. minority population in the entire U.S. will be of ethnic minorities. Now, when people see this number, these changes in the demographics of American society, there's one fear that I keep hearing. And this fear was actually echoed first by Harvard professor Diana Eck. She didn't say it as a fear, but it came out as such. The fear was that the more immigrants you get, the more non-Europeans you have in America, the less Christian America is going to be. In fact, these non-Western Europeans are going to bring non-Christian faith into American society. And in fact, there has been some places, and maybe it's even in your hometown and in your neighborhood, where 20 years ago there wasn't a Buddhist temple, and now there is a Buddhist temple. 20 years ago there wasn't a Hindu temple, and now there is a Hindu temple. But people have freaked out about this Buddhist temple in their neighborhood. They're saying, oh no, we have a Buddhist temple in our neighborhood. What's going to happen? What if they have an evangelistic crusade to reach our teenagers? They're going to convert our teenagers. You know nothing about Buddhism. That's not how that works. What's going to happen with all this Buddhist temple that's in our neighborhood? So what happened was folks got really preoccupied with that one Buddhist temple and ignored the 15 Korean churches that started at the same time, the Chinese churches that started at the same time, the 5 Laotian, the 3 Karen churches, all these other churches that started at the same time as that one Buddhist temple. Because what Stephen Warner points out from the University of Illinois is that the new immigrants represent not the de-Christianization of American society, but the de-Europeanization of American Christianity. Notice the very profound distinction there. Because immigrants are coming in does not mean we become less Christians. It means Christianity becomes less European in its demographic and in its face. Above all, the new immigrants make it decreasingly plausible for Americans to think of Christianity as a white person's religion. And although it may not be apparent in many congregations, American Christians are increasingly people of color. We'll see this in the large and growing denominations, Baptists and Pentecostals. If you got all the Baptists together, they would split off the First Baptist over there, Second Baptist over there. But still, if you got all the Baptists together, you would have a very diverse group of people. If you got all the Pentecostals together, a lot of confusion, but you would have a very diverse group of people. There is diversity in the growing large denomination. The smaller, declining denominations tend to be mono-ethnic, overwhelmingly white. Lutherans, 96% white. I'm still looking for that 4% Lutherans of color. I haven't met them yet. I'm sure they're out there according to the statistic. But the more mono-ethnic, overwhelmingly white you are, the more likely you are to be a declining denomination. What we're finding is that the fastest growing religious identification is spiritual but not religious. In 1990, when they had that number, it was at 4% of the U.S. population. 25 years later, at 2015, it was 20% of the U.S. population. Now that, mostly, largely, are white mainline young people and white evangelical young people walking away from church saying, I have that spirituality, and if you quiz me on who Jesus is and those kinds of things, I believe it, I know it, but I don't go to church on Sunday. I might go to a bar and hang out and talk about spirituality, but I won't go to church on Sunday or to become part of an organized religion. That is the fastest growing religious identification. It went from 4% to 20%. If I can put it in kind of stark terms, this is the greatest threat to evangelical Christianity in the United States right now. The growing number of young people in particular, young white people in particular, who are identifying as spiritual but not religious. The group that is not a threat is the group that went from 0.4% of the population to 0.9% of the population in the same time period. So in that 25-year time period, it went from 0.4 to 0.9, still under 1%. That group is the Muslim community. They are not a threat to Christianity. It's the former Christians that are a threat to the decline of Christianity, not the less than 1% of Muslims in the world. That's not, in the United States, that's not a threat to American Christianity. It is actually the decline of mostly white millennials, evangelicals, and mainliners who are now leaving the church and saying we are spiritual but not religious. What we're dealing with then is a drastic change in the population of American Christianity. This is very evidenced by a part of the region of the country that was always seen as spiritually dead. I moved to Boston in 1991. I lived in Maryland for most of my life, and when I went to Boston to start seminary, my church laid hands and prayed that I would not lose my salvation in the evil city of Boston. They prayed, said, Lord, protect this young man from the evils of Boston. I'm driving up I-95 from Maryland to go up to Boston, scared out of my mind that I'm going to lose my faith in the wicked city of Boston. When I got there, I found something radically different. People had told me everywhere I went that Boston was an evil city. I learned two things about Boston. First of all, Boston has better sports teams than Seattle. That I learned. The second thing I learned about Boston, Super Bowl, people, Super Bowl. The second thing I learned about Boston is that it is a spiritually vibrant community. There are some amazing things that are happening in the city of Boston. In fact, in the year 1970, there were only about 300 churches in the entire city of Boston. That's relatively small, but Boston's not a huge city, 500,000 people. The current estimate, this is actually 2006, by 2006, about 30 years later, there were 600 churches in the city of Boston. There was a net gain of 300. There was actually a gain of 450 churches because 150 of those 300 churches closed down and then 450 new churches started up. But notice here that the churches that are right now in Boston, most are ethnic immigrant churches and most speak a service in a language other than English. In the time period between 2001 to 2006, 5-year time period, 98 new churches were planted in the city of Boston. That's phenomenal. That's a phenomenal rate of growth and church planting. Almost 100 churches planted in a city of 500,000 people. 76 churches reported their language of worship. Half of those churches reported they spoke in a language other than English. The 22 that did not respond, the survey was done in English. They spoke a language other than English. They didn't respond to the survey. What we're talking about is a significant change in the demographics of Christianity. Boston, seen as spiritually dead. Why? Because the revival in Boston is not happening in the white churches. It's happening in the Asian communities, the African American communities, the Spanish-speaking congregation. As noted here, of the 88 new churches planted in a 10-year time period, half of those churches are Spanish-speaking congregations. A quarter of those churches are African American churches, and 15% are Asian American churches. There is a dramatic change in the demographics of Christianity in the world today, and Christianity in the United States. So one response is to be fearful that immigrants are going to make America less Christian. The other response is even more secular and more wrong, which is to say we have to keep America white. Let's make America white again. Let's make sure that the founding makeup of this country remains the same. We want to stop that 2042 number as much as possible. And so what we need to do then is we need to double down on the systems and structures that maintain the power reality and the power distribution so that we can retain the systems that made America white before and make America white again. So there's a doubling down over the last several decades, but especially in the last couple of years, on a system that says, and a narrative that says, we need to keep America a certain way. We have to make sure that this diversity, this browning of America, does not happen. So that's what we read about in Acts chapter 15, verse 1 and 5. Where it says, certain individuals came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses. What is happening in Acts 15, 1 and 5? The old guard is nervous about the demographic changes. And so if we want these Gentiles to be Christian, we need to make them Jews first, and then they can become Christian. So there had to be kind of another cultural hoop they had to jump through in order to become accepted as Christians in that society. And that's called what I would describe as a cultural captivity. A cultural captivity to a particular culture that says convert to that culture and then we will accept you into the Christian faith. That variation is now found in the 20th and 21st century in the United States, where there is a Western white cultural captivity of Christianity. If you are going to be accepted as a Christian, you must convert not only to becoming a follower of Jesus, but you must also culturally convert to a form of whiteness. And what it does is it perpetuates the narrative that has existed for several centuries now in the United States, the narrative of white supremacy. Let's unpack that a little bit more to say what has happened in our society that has led to this narrative of cultural captivity and white supremacy. Peter Berger and Thomas Luckman talk about the way social systems are constructed. Without going into too much detail about this diagram, what we're seeing here is how various factors work through a system and strengthen and build that system. The process of individuals externalizing their value. The process of those values getting institutionalized within a system. The process of that institution now internalizing that value system within the individual. So that the cycle continues and it strengthens the social system and the social reality. This social system, however, needs fuel to further that system. It needs fuel to keep it going. And it's not relying upon other types of energy. It is actually needing what we call mediating narratives. There are different ways this is spoken of. Mediating narratives. George Lakoff uses the term metaphors. Willie Jennings and Will Cavanaugh uses the term imagination. These are just kind of different ways of saying that in order to keep a social system in its current state and continuing to perpetuate, narratives, metaphors, and imagination is necessary to continue to keep that system. And especially if it is a dysfunctional, broken system, the narratives become important to sustain that dysfunctional, broken system. Walter Wink points out that there is something called the myth of redemptive violence. that says in order to keep this narrative of exceptionalism, this system of exceptionalism, you must introduce the myth of redemptive violence. America as the arsenal of democracy. America as an armed nation able to use violence for the purpose of peace. That narrative is a dysfunctional narrative that further perpetuates the existing system. One of those narratives that is perpetuating the existing system that must be reformed, that must be confronted, as I'm arguing, is the cultural system of white Western captivity of the church in Western culture. And that social reality is affirmed by the mediating narrative of white supremacy. And that white supremacy is the engine, the fuel, which fuels this cultural captivity, which fuels the centering of whiteness in Western Christianity and in global Christianity right now. So let's talk about some of the mediating narratives and where they come from. One background for this comes from the work of Kelly Brown Douglas at Goucher University. She writes in the book Stand Your Ground about the myth of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Where did this mythology come from? She traces it back to the 1st century, to a Roman author by the name of Tacitus, who writes a book called Germania. And in that book, he notes that these northern tribes in northern Germany, the tribes of northern Germany, that they have a particular physical appearance. And the way he describes it is kind of light in skin, light in hair color, light in eye color, and larger in frame and in stature. Now that's, the description itself is relatively harmless. But what Tacitus does is he equates or he connects that physical appearance to a particular ability. And he notes that these German tribes that have lighter skin, lighter hair, lighter eyes, and larger in stature, they have a greater capacity for self-governance, meaning they do better at democracy than other groups. Tacitus notes that this is a link between the genetics and the physical appearance of a people group and their capacity to self-govern or their capacity to do democracy. That translates into this purity of the physical appearance, translates to the purity of blood. That the purity of the blood of the northern Germanic tribes, especially when it encounters the Anglo tribes, creates this mythology that there is a unique people group called the Anglo-Saxons, who are light in skin, light in hair color, light in eye color, and larger in stature, who excel at democracy. This is one of many different threads of white supremacy. The belief that the purity of whiteness results in a particular type of excellence, in this case, in self-governance. Now, you're listening to this and that's crazy. Who would equate physical appearance to the capacity for democracy? Who would equate the lightness of skin to the capacity for democracy? I was at a conference, an evangelical conference, and I was speaking on this issue. And a woman raises her hand and says, I have to disagree with you. And I said, are you disagreeing with my analysis? I can refer you to this text. I can tell you about what I read. She said, no, I agree with your analysis. I disagree with you that that's not true. What do you mean? Because I believe that Middle East Muslims do not have the capacity for democracy that white Americans do. This was in a Christian conference, in a gathering of 100 people, explicitly stating what Tacitus had said 2,000 years ago. That a physical appearance, a genetic appearance, and a purity in that blood results in a capacity to do certain things better than other people. This is flat-out racism. This is also white supremacy. That thought process, by the way, comes through the culture, and it becomes evident in the 15th and 16th century. And this idea of maintaining purity, the purity of race, the purity of an exceptional people, and ends up in a group that also begins to emphasize purity. We call them the Puritans, who believe not only in the purity of their religious affiliation, but also in the purity of their blood. And so that ideology comes into the United States in the form of the belief that Western bodies and Western minds have a superior capacity to other bodies and other minds. Therefore, you can go to the continent of Africa, because the Western body and mind is the true image bearer of God, and take into possession other bodies that are not Western bodies as chattel slave labor. and bring them into the New World. Therefore, you can go into the continent of North America and South America, view a continent filled with millions of people and thousands of civilization, and say, I discovered something. My good friend Mark Charles, I'm writing a book with Mark Charles, a Navajo Christian, says if you really believe that's how discovery works, that you can discover something that's owned by somebody else, by all means leave your iPads and iPhones here. I will come around and discover them for you. We'll see if you still agree about how discovery works. But that's what was stated, because the assumption of a superiority or a supremacy of the European body and mind and soul and spirit over and against red bodies and brown bodies and black bodies. And the belief that we bring something superior, therefore the North American continent is a blank slate. That dysfunctional narrative, that dysfunctional imagination has been the fuel for much of the formation of this cultural captivity, for a demographic, for a theological reality that the demographic reality is now butting up against. What's another example of this? How has this assumption of white supremacy been a part of the norm of our society? This is the work of Willie Jennings that I'm kind of building upon here. And the question is, whose gaze or whose perspective determines one's worth in American society? Who determines who is valuable and who is not, and why they are valuable and why they are not? When the white male gazes upon the black male, what is the perception of the black male that is carried out into society because the white male has determined that is what the black male is? A pet or a threat? Think, for example, the acceptable black male in American society. That black male is the entertainer, is the athlete, is the hip-hop star, as long as they're Christian and talks about reformation. So you're talking about black males as pets who are acceptable as long as they stay in that role. The great prophet Dave Chappelle. Dave Chappelle says that one of the reasons he walks away from $20 to $30 million from Comedy Central is because they were trying to make him into a pet. He notes that every strong black male comedian in Hollywood at one point in their career has to appear in drag. Eddie Murphy, Tyler Perry, Martin Lawrence, Jamie Foxx. Strong black men, to make them appear more as pets, they put them in some kind of dress to make them less threatening. Or maybe another example would be that, let's say you are a Super Bowl leading quarterback, hypothetical. And you have great stats, and you've done really well, and because of your success on the football field as a player that has led his team, quarterback that has led his team to the Super Bowl, you are seen as an acceptable black male who, as an athlete, successful athlete, is considered a pet. But the second you take a knee, you are no longer the pet, you are now a threat, and you must be eliminated and not allowed to play in the NFL ever again. Or you might be a Christian hip-hop artist whom fans love because you're singing about propitiation and reformation and justification by faith. All those great things that roll off your tongue as a rap star. So you have this hip-hop artist who appeals to the larger Christian evangelical audience, but the second he posts a tweet about slavery and racism, he is no longer the pet, he is now a threat. And those threats must be eliminated. Not allowed to be in roles of position and influence anymore because you've moved away from being the pet to being the threat. The biggest threat to American society, according to the media, is the unidentified black male. The unidentified black male today on the north side of Chicago was guilty of knocking over a liquor store. An unidentified black male shot up a car this afternoon on the west side of Chicago. An unidentified black male was involved in a gang shooting on the south side of Chicago. This unidentified black male is approximately 15 to 40 years old, weighs anywhere from 150 to 350 pounds, is anywhere from 5'7" to 6'7" inches tall. If you have seen such a black male, you must contact the authorities immediately because he is a threat to your society. He is a threat to your world. And so that's why a 17-year-old in a hoodie, unarmed, with nothing but Skittles and iced tea in his pocket, is a threat. That's why a large, 6'4", 300-pound, unarmed, 18-year-old is a threat. Even if the person that shot him is 6'5", 275 pounds, with a gun, the the 18-year-old is still the greater threat, unarmed. That's why even a 12-year-old boy playing at a playground in Cleveland is a threat, because he is simply the unidentified black male. These narratives of who gets to determine who is a pet or a threat in society is part of the narrative of white supremacy. What happens, though, when the black male gazes upon somebody else? His perspective. What happens, for example, when the black male gazes upon the white female? History teaches us that Emmett Till is what happens to the black male who gazes upon the white female. History shows us that when the black male is seen especially as a sexually violent threat to the white male, that black male must be eliminated and dealt with as quickly as possible. And that's why it was not an accident when a presidential candidate, in his opening address to announce his presidency, when he says, Mexicans are rapists, that is not code. That is explicit racism playing into this whole narrative. To identify a male of color as a rapist, first and foremost, is clearly playing into this narrative of the gaze of the white male determines the threat of anybody and everybody else. How do we see this in the ways we engage the larger narrative of ministry? As was mentioned, I do a lot of work in urban ministry, and I began to question and ask questions about how do we view urban ministry, and how is that gaze of urban ministry determined by the dominant culture rather than by those who are actually living in the city. So I started looking at book covers over a long period of time, and how these book covers reflect a narrative from the perspective of the dominant culture. That the dominant culture's perspective determines how we view something like urban ministry. So the very early stages of it is that American society, Western society, white society, viewed cities as a city set on a hill. The words of John Winthrop. The words of many of the colonialists who said, we're going to build a great Christian society, and our urban centers are going to be that Christian society. But what happens is that these urban centers start having an influx of Italian Catholics, Slavic Jews, Polish Jews, and Eastern Orthodox Christians. Because of that, along with African Americans moving into urban centers, the perception of the city changes from New Jerusalem's city set on a hill to a secular city, to much more of the unheavenly city. So now the perception of the city is determined by the gaze of the white male who says these places are evil. They are Babylon by choice, no longer Jerusalem, the chosen city. They are sick cities, and we must understand their pathology. In the city, home is a dirty street. Is there hope for this city? And this is where the narrative begins to turn. So now that there is a determination that the white male's gaze of the city is of a dysfunctional city, who needs now to save the city? Well, it's a church that takes on trouble. It's people who dare to love the ghetto. How dare they? There is an urban challenge where we can reclaim America's cities. We must take our cities for God. We must send apostles to the city. We're going to be the change agents for these cities. We're going to unleash white pastors in skinny jeans to go into the urban settings. To be an unstoppable force. To do greater things in the city. Because greater things have yet to come. Greater things have yet to be done in the city. Yay, 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 yay. So think with me about this narrative. The narrative that centralizes the gaze of the white male over and against all other narratives. That you have to send good apostles from the suburbs to the city. This adds into and perpetuates the narrative, the mediating narrative of white supremacy. It adds into and it perpetuates the social reality of a broken system that perpetuates white supremacy. Revelation chapter 18 says it in this way, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Babylon the Great is the secular system that has been structured and created. The merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxury. Then I heard another voice saying, but you've got to come out of her, my people. Which is strange because we're his people, and somehow we are in the midst of Babylon. You must not partake in her sins, so that you do not share in her plagues. And the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Here's the truth. God in his infinite and right judgment will judge Babylon. We, the Christians, are going to be asked, though, how much were you in bed with Babylon? How much did you prostitute yourself with Babylon? The systems of the world, the social narratives of the world. How much did you prostitute yourself with her to such an extent that you are now indistinguishable and God has to call you out of that corrupt and broken system? How much has the church bought into prostitution with a narrative of white empire? How much has the church in America bought into the narrative of power and empire and religious freedom and the right to appoint the right Supreme Court justices and the right to hang on to white supremacy? How much has the church in America has bought into that narrative of white supremacy and Babylon? I would say about 81% of it has bought into that narrative. So what we're seeing then is a dysfunctional, broken, jacked up narrative that instead of the church fighting that narrative and saying, let us now bring the reformation, the renewal, the revival to a broken and messed up system, we have instead bought into that system. And we have actually continued to buy into that dysfunctional narrative. And God says, come out of her. Come out of her. For it is a system that is destined for brokenness. So how then do we do this? I'll offer you just a couple of things before closing. Acts chapter 15, verses 2 through 4 gives us a little bit of a snapshot of how that cultural captivity in the early church is broken. Peter and Barnabas were appointed to go up to Jerusalem. The church sent them on their way, and as they traveled through Phoenicia and Samaria, they told how the Gentiles had been converted. This news made all the believers very glad. When they came to Jerusalem, they were welcomed by the church and the apostles and elders, to whom they reported everything God had done through them. This is good news. One of the ways we combat this captivity is to actually rejoice in the good things that God is already doing. To share the good news of the church throughout the world. To share the good news of the growth of the churches in the United States. To share this good news and to join together in the celebration of this good news. I'll give you a couple of incidents of this. One, for example, we celebrate that the growth of the church in America is being driven now by the immigrant church. We rejoice in it and not wring our hands over it. We delight in the move of God through the immigrant churches in the United States. We also might think of different ways we look at the move of God throughout the world. So, for example, I'm of a certain age where when I went to mission conferences in college and seminary, we were really focusing on a particular topic of prayer. In my early years of college and seminary, we were really praying for the fall of the communist bloc countries. We were praying that the Iron Curtain would fall, that God would allow the gospel to go into places like Russia and into China. And guess what? God answered our prayer. God answered the prayer. The Iron Curtain did fall. The gospel did have access into these countries, so that by my senior year in seminary, my mission professor was an Eastern European. And get this, if you want to know what is the most Christian nation in the world right now in terms of the actual number of Christians, do you know what country it is? It's not the United States. It's China. China has about 30 million official Christians according to the state church numbers. Once you start adding the numbers that are related to the house churches and the underground churches, the projection is anywhere from 200 to 300 million Christians in China. How many people are there in the United States? 300 million. It's possible that right now there are more Christians in China than people in the United States. So God answered our prayers. We prayed for the gospel to go into these places. And so we actually started switching our prayer life. And we stopped praying for maybe the communist bloc countries, but we started praying for a new people group. And that people group over the last 20 to 25 years has been the focus of our prayer life. That people group has been Muslims. We've been praying for creative ways to take the gospel into the Muslim world for the last 20, 25 years. It's been the focus of our mission conferences, the books that we've written, mission classes. We've been praying for God to reach the Muslim countries and the Muslim people for the last 20, 25 years. And guess what? Once again, God answered our prayers, but in a very interesting and unique way. He says, actually, you don't have to go to Syria or Lebanon. You don't have to go to a war-torn nation where your life might be in jeopardy. I'm just going to send you 20 to 25,000 refugees from these countries. And as a church, love them and care for them and share the gospel with them. And you will have the chance to reach the Muslim community. But it was the Christians who stood at the front and says, no, we don't want you here. So God is doing some amazing things. Are we going to be a part of that good work of God? And I will leave one more challenge. That part of what's happening in Acts 15, verse 2 and 4 is the mutual learning. Paul and Barnabas are not only going to places to teach, they're learning from these communities. There is a mutuality in learning. And so one way to break the cycle of white supremacy is for the whites not to be supreme all the time. To have these places where that supremacy is challenged and undermined. And here's one of the best ways to do that, to have mentors, spiritual leaders, pastors, professors that are of a different ethnicity than yourself. A few years ago, I was speaking at Wheaton College. I shouldn't have said that. At some random Christian school in the Midwest. You'll see why in a minute. And I said to that school, you have a wonderful reputation for missions. You've been a great mission-sending agency for the 20th century, but now in the 21st century, if you are a white student wanting to be a missionary into the world, and you've never had a non-white mentor, you're not a missionary, you're a colonialist. You're going to colonize the world with your brand of white evangelical Christianity. That is not the full gospel of Jesus Christ. So what you need to do is find mentors, pastors, professors, staff, who are going to mentor you cross-culturally. And then the other thing I said was, and if your school doesn't do that, you need to ask for your money back. That's why I've never been asked back to speak. Because if your faculty, staff, and administration does not reflect what America is going to look like in 2042, you're not getting your money's worth. Because you're getting an education that fit for 1965. So pay 1965 tuition, because that's the education that you're getting. Sorry. But how do we then change the equation? We start learning from one another. We start reading each other's books a little bit more. We start putting ourselves under the submission and authority of those that are different from ourselves. That is where we break this cycle of supremacy. And that reform is desperately needed in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Just before Dr. Rah came up to speak, I said, bring the preach. And he did. Thank you very much for that profound exhortation. I hope that it's been convicting to us all. If you would like to learn more from Dr. Rah, we have a book table out in the foyer with several of his books. Please check that out at the end of today's session. We also have a 3:30 talkback session in Demery 150, where you can come and ask questions and have a discussion with Dr. Rah. You'll see in your program that we have many, many opportunities to continue your learning today. 23 sessions in the afternoon with cross-disciplinary input, faculty, staff, students, lots of opportunities to learn more. I would encourage you to attend those. They are held at 1 o'clock and again at 2 o'clock. And then in the afternoon at 4:30, there will be a film screening up under the bridge, which is a wonderful documentary on homelessness in Tent City. Many of you may have heard that we will be hosting Tent City 3 again here on campus in November. And so this is a great opportunity to come and learn more about Tent Cities, and also to hear from Maurice Young, who's an activist that's featured in that film. He will be there and available to answer questions at the end of the film screening. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope that you've been encouraged, I hope that you've been convicted, and I hope that you will take the opportunity to learn more throughout the day. Thank you, and you're dismissed.